Hello and welcome back to Endemic Times. My name is Amira. Why did five prominent news organizations recently come together in a joint statement calling for the United States to drop its charges against Julian Assange? This is the question that I have been asking myself all week since the letter was revealed. I keep thinking, why now? What is it about this moment in time that is prompting these news organizations to somewhat call for a backing down of the US stance against Julian Assange? And keep in mind that they are not even calling for a full release of Assange, but for the US to drop its charges against Assange for the obtaining and publication of classified diplomatic and military secrets. These same news organizations have been mostly silent on Assange, the horrific treatment he has and is currently experiencing while in custody, but also during the time when the US government was putting in a concerted effort to assassinate Assange. While it's a good thing to see some solidarity, maybe that's what we can call this, for me, in my opinion, this goes a lot deeper than Assange into more of what really looks like a big CYA for news outlets across the board. Let's look at the particulars of this letter. In a joint open letter, The Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and El País said the prosecution of Mr. Assange under the Espionage Act sets a dangerous precedent that threatened to undermine the First Amendment and the freedom of the press. The letter then went on to say that obtaining and disclosing sensitive information when necessary in the public interest is a core part of the daily work of journalists, and that if that work is criminalized, our public discourse and our democracies are made significantly weaker. Yes, a core function of the press, or what should be a core function, is the adversity to authority. Whether that authority is a president, member of Congress, a royal, a billionaire, a celebrity, all of these aspects of our society should be under more of a critical view and a microscope so as to reveal the truth. Sadly, in the wake of the last 2 years, there has been a big shift from seeking the truth and exposing truth to speaking particular truths, curated from news organizations that are trying to toe a specific line and keep certain perspectives, beliefs, and yes, approved truths, so as to stay in the good graces of the very presidents, congressmen and women, royals, billionaires, and celebrities because they want to retain their access. This, I posit here, is why I think a reckoning is happening within our mainstream media. Journalists have always faced critique, and in recent years, the attempts by the government to obtain information from journalists has gotten more extreme. Merrick Garland, of all people, has tried to rein in ways that the Justice Department has made it harder for journalists to do their jobs. This October, he issued new regulations that ban the use of subpoenas, warrants, or court orders to seize reporters' communications records or demand their notes or testimony in an effort to uncover confidential sources in leak investigations. In order for journalists to do their job, confidentiality of sources is imperative to get to the bottom of a story and also to provide protections. Very much like whistleblowers, sources, especially critical of the government activities that are putting millions of lives at risk, should be protected. The obvious overreach of the US government to try to use the justice system to subvert the protections of sources because that source knows what the government is doing and the government doesn't want them exposed is huge and should be a bigger story than it sadly usually is. Outlets like The Times and Le Monde, etc., are looked at as more established media outlets, but as they say in their letter, they also write about national security matters and have sources with crucial information about the government. They have these sources and information because it is and should be information disseminated to the public. The public is owed more transparency than we usually get, and these large media conglomerates have moments in time of being adversarial and seeking to expose truths, and other times where they are silent and let information sit. What comes to my mind is a story like Epstein. This was a man that was investigated and talked about in the inner circles of media in New York for over a decade. His escapades had been investigated and a story was ready to come forward. But because of wanting access to the royal wedding, the story was shelved, and it was 3 years later that the same story was revealed on a different network. I mean, if the Epstein cover-up doesn't make you question everything about mainstream media and the way that it works, then I don't know what will. The case against Assange is so unique and noteworthy, primarily because this is something that has never really been done before. There is no precedent in the US for prosecuting a publisher of information under the Espionage Act. It brings up many questions of the First Amendment and the freedom of the press. It could be argued that the charges being brought against Assange could easily be levied against mainstream media news outlets. Traditional news outlets do seek and publish information that officials want want to be secret, including classified national security matters. This is why I think they are starting to transition from their usual narrative around Assange. As the government continues to aim for more censorship and silencing of dissent, it makes Assange and everything surrounding him that much more prescient. We have now entered into another US wartime where billions of dollars are being funneled into a foreign nation with very little oversight, and who knows what else is happening in the background. Governments are always trying to cover their tracks, so it makes sense to question their motives. As I said on Twitter not long ago, when you're not even allowed to ask questions, that's a big red flag. The government's actions toward Assange and their desperate attempts to portray him as the villain in this story is further shown in how quickly the indictments came down against Assange. When the CIA plot to kidnap and assassinate Assange was underway, a concerted effort by the US government took place to expeditiously pin charges against Assange as quickly as possible, since the CIA's plans could derail any criminal charges against Assange. And this is something that mainstream media outlets are not discussing: the subversive actions by the US government in concert with British counterparts to come up with scenarios involving gun battles on the streets of London, to crashing a Russian diplomatic vehicle containing Assange, grabbing him, and shooting out tires of a Russian plane, is once again the makings of a silly Hollywood movie. This is next level absurdity, and it has been out in the open. They are not even trying to hide their disdain for Assange. Their hate for Assange and visible attempts to silence him is because of what he has divulged. Whether people like the information or not, it is a level of transparency that the US government does not want. It was never about the safety of the individuals whose names were redacted. It was about the fact that Assange disclosed over 90,000 Afghanistan war-related activity reports, 400,000 Iraq war-related significant activity reports, and 250,000 US Department State cables. Cables that revealed secret things from around the world, including dossiers about the Guantanamo Bay detainees, who have been held without trial, along with the higher than official estimates of civilian casualties in those regions. In my Costs of War video, I actually covered the amount of civilian deaths that occurred from the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. The numbers are startlingly huge and so much higher than previously reported. I will link that video at the end. But it is these very details that keeps the US government so on edge, because they do not and cannot have the truth of our military interventions divulged. Because if people knew the real death toll, the real casualties, the trauma and pain that has been inflicted because of our imperialistic actions in foreign nations, no one would sign up. And that, to me, is one of the many reasons why the US government has put forth such an effort to rid themselves of Assange. I'm glad that these media outlets are finally saying what should be said, but I hope that they go farther and demand for his release, because Julian Assange should be free. So now, for those of you that stuck around, you get to hear a little bit of my take and why I think that these news organizations are doing this now. This might be a little out there for some, but follow me on this journey, because it may just be some of the many reasons, because there are many, that all of this is happening. The reckoning of Elon Musk at Twitter is hard to look away from, because there's just so much. But one of the reasons why I think media outlets are doing what they're doing now with Assange is part and parcel with the Hunter Biden laptop story. I don't want to go into the exhaustive details here, but I think the thing to keep in mind is that the evidence of Twitter working alongside the government to keep the Hunter Biden story under wraps exposes what a lot of people on the outside and in independent media have been saying, which is that social media companies and even news outlets are pushing or covering up certain stories because they are inconvenient for the time. It was extremely inconvenient for the Hunter Biden story to come forward when it did, hence the cover-up. And news organizations did the same thing. It was deemed a conspiracy theory, and no one wanted or did talk about it, especially on more liberal-leaning media. I think Elon exposing this connection is why mainstream media is shaking in their boots. I think they are wanting to do a huge CYA for when, not if, but the when more is exposed about the depths of collusion going on between news and social media outlets and the government. I already touched on it a little bit, but I do think that Epstein is a really critical piece in the covering up of inconvenient truths by media outlets. There was so much about Epstein, his connections, his wealth, and even, yes, the proclivities of Epstein that were known for almost 2 decades. From Vanity Fair to CBS, these news outlets knew that there was something going on and went out of their way to keep stories hidden or under wraps because they wanted to retain access. These decisions were made at the very top by individuals that had either something to gain or something to lose. When you're covering up the Epstein story, I can't help but think you had something to lose, either money or reputation. So, yeah. And lastly, and also most controversially, I think that there is going to be a reckoning when it comes to the pandemic. The rush to find so called solutions to get back to normal and to get people back in their positions led to what I think is going to be the worst time for journalistic integrity. Questioning, as journalists should, the origins of COVID was quickly made a conspiracy theory that resulted in people getting removed and canceled. Talking about the efficacy of vaccines is still extremely controversial because it disrupts the narrative. The narrative about what they are, how they work, how this particular one works, and adverse reactions. Things like irregular periods for women at the very beginning was scoffed at, and women were made to feel like they were crazy. But data now shows that changes to menstruation has and continues to occur. There is also the incredible amount of excess deaths that, when looking at the data, coincides with the beginning of the jabs. Myocarditis, arrhythmias from excess inflammation, and other adverse reactions continue to plague the population. All while the media, over the last 2 years, was making every effort to silence and ridicule anyone that was simply asking questions. They were not acting like journalists. They were acting like narrative gatekeepers. And that gatekeeping has led to people being forced into making decisions that they should never have had to make. There was hardly any pushback on mandates, the so-called science, and most egregiously, the fact that forcing people to get something that has been so little tested as a contingency for making a living. That was when we needed the press to be contentious as fuck. And they weren't. They pushed the narratives and contributed to the horrific divisions we are continuing to see. I think when this all comes forward, whether it's a year from now, 5 years, or a couple of decades, I think mainstream media knows that they screwed people over. They chose access, they chose convenience. And I think this is why they are taking this step now with Assange. They want a little good grace before it all gets revealed, if it ever does. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, feel free to give it a thumbs down and leave me a comment down below and let me know what you think about all of this. I know that this is a lot. I'm looking at a lot of different things and some might not see these connections, and that's okay. This is just where I'm coming from. So please feel free to share this video with someone that you think might like it, subscribe, and hit the bell for when I have more videos coming out. And as always, remember to stay safe, take care, and be kind to each other.